Before we start, let me ask you something. Have you ever signed a contract without reading it? A car loan, a mortgage, an app's terms and conditions. Keep that in mind as I tell you this story. Tuesday, February 8th, 1983. The clock on the wall behind Mark Anderson's desk showed 9:47 a.m. when he reached the 11th name on his list. Pottawatomie County Savings Bank in Council Bluffs, Iowa, occupied a brick building on 4th Street that had witnessed 50 years of farm loans handshakes and broken promises. Mark had been making phone calls since 9 o'clock. 14 names, 14 families, 14 operating loans being called in full. The farm crisis had turned from whisper to scream. Interest rates at 18%. Corn prices below $2 a bushel. Land values cut in half since 1981. The Omaha examiners had visited 3 times in 4 months, each visit leaving deeper lines in the bank president's face. The board had decided that mercy was a luxury they could no longer afford. Mark worked down the list alphabetically. Anderson first, then Benke, then Allen. Each conversation followed the same terrible script. He would identify himself, reference the loan, then deliver the words that ended everything. Pay in full within 90 days, or the bank seizes the collateral. The collateral in every case was the land. Anderson had gone quiet, then asked how much, then his voice had cracked. Benke had shouted that the bank couldn't do this, but the bank could, and Benke knew it even as he said the words. Allen Jacob Allen, 320 acres, 3 generations, had said something that made Mark's throat tighten. Jonathan warned me. He told me to read it. I didn't listen. Mark had made calls like this before, but never 14 in one morning. Never with a list this long. By the 10th call, his voice had gone mechanical. By the 10th call, he had stopped hearing the panic on the other end as panic and started hearing it as sound. The 11th name was Wright, Jonathan Wright, 280 acres south of Neola. Operating loan of $42,000 at 14.5% variable rate, secured by a first lien on the farm. Mark had reviewed the file that morning. Payment history, perfect. Every installment on time for 18 years. Didn't matter. The loan-to-value ratio had exceeded 70% when land values collapsed. The acceleration clause gave the bank the right. Mark dialed the number and waited. A man's voice answered on the second ring. Wright residence, Mark Anderson, calling from Pottawatomie County Savings Bank. I need to speak with Jonathan Wright regarding his operating loan. Speaking. Mr. Wright, I'm calling to inform you that the bank is exercising its right to accelerate your loan and demand payment in full. You have 90 days from today to read me the clause. Mark stopped. In 10 calls that morning, no farmer had interrupted him. They had listened. They had gone quiet. They had asked how much. They had asked why. They had begged. Nobody had asked him to read the clause. I'm sorry, the acceleration clause. The one that gives you the right to call the loan. Read it to me word for word. Mr. Wright, I don't have the actual loan document in front of. I do. I'm looking at it right now. Section 7, paragraph 3, the acceleration clause. It says the bank may call the loan in full if, and I'm reading directly here, if the borrower fails to maintain the collateral in a condition consistent with its appraised value at the time of origination. That's the trigger, Mr. Anderson. That's the only trigger in my contract, not market conditions, not the bank's portfolio, not the board's decision. The only way you can call my loan is if I've damaged the collateral. Mark's hand tightened on the receiver. He glanced at the file in front of him, but the file contained only summaries, not the original documents. Mr. Wright, the bank's position is that declining land values constitute a failure to maintain. Declining land values are a market condition, Mr. Anderson, not a maintenance failure. My farm is in better condition today than the day I signed that loan. The fences are tight. The buildings are painted. The soil is tested and limed. The drainage is maintained. I haven't damaged the collateral. The market damaged the price. Those are two different things, and my contract doesn't say anything about the market. The words came without hesitation, without anger, without fear. They came like water running downhill, finding every gap in Mark's script and flowing through. Mark Anderson had delivered 10 death sentences that morning. This was the first time someone had fought back. I'd like to speak with Mr. Jackson at his earliest convenience. I'd suggest he bring my loan file. The original, not a summary. The original document with my signature on it. Mark set the receiver down and sat at his desk for a full minute before making the next call. He had just spoken to the only farmer on his list of 14 who had read his own loan contract, and that farmer had been smiling. Mark Anderson had no way of knowing that the man on the other end of the phone had been preparing for this exact moment for 26 years. Not since he was a grown man, since he was 16 years old, standing in a kitchen doorway, watching his father break. October 1957, Neola, Iowa. Jonathan Wright was 16 years old and standing in the hallway outside the kitchen when his father came home from the bank. Edward Harris had walked through that door 10,000 times, but Jonathan knew something was different before his father's boots crossed the threshold. The way a man carries defeat is different from the way he carries exhaustion. Edward sat down at the kitchen table. He put his head in his hands. Margaret Harris was rolling dough for dinner, and she stopped when she saw her husband's face. "What happened?" Edward didn't look up. His voice came muffled through his palms. "They called the loan. The bank. They're calling the loan." Margaret's hands were still dusty with flour. She didn't move. "You've never missed a payment." "I know." "Then they can't." "They can. The contract allows it. Howard showed me the clause. Page 6. Jonathan pressed his back against the hallway wall and listened. His father's voice sounded like something had torn inside it. The Omaha people bought First National 3 months ago. They raised the rate from 6% to 9.5%. Then they decided they want additional collateral. 40 acres. I don't have 40 acres unencumbered. Everything I own is the 280 that's already pledged. Margaret's voice went very quiet. How much time? 30 days. $8,000 in 30 days, or they take the land. We don't have $8,000. I know. Jonathan stood in the hallway and watched his father sit at that table with his head in his hands, and he understood something in that moment that most 16-year-old boys don't understand. A man could do everything right, work the land, make every payment, keep every promise, and still lose everything because of words on a page he hadn't read. What did Howard say? Edward's head came up. His eyes were red. Howard said, "It's not his decision anymore. The Omaha people make the calls now. He said my contract allows it. He said he's sorry. Your contract allows what? The acceleration clause. Page 6. The bank can call the loan for any reason. Any reason. Any reason." Margaret sat down across from her husband. The flour on her hands left white prints on the dark wood. "You didn't know that was in there?" Edward's voice broke on the words. I didn't read page 6. Howard was my friend. We played baseball together. Our wives are in the same church circle. I trusted him. Jonathan Wright listened from the hallway, and something inside him changed. Not broke, changed. Like metal changing shape under heat. October 1957. Edward Harris sold 120 acres to Raymond Peterson, a neighbor who had cash and saw opportunity in another man's misfortune. $300 per acre when the land was worth $500, $36,000 raised, $8,000 paid to the bank. The rest went into an account that would have to last until the next harvest and the harvest after that, and however many harvests it took for Edward to become himself again. Except Edward never became himself again. Jonathan watched his father age a decade in 6 months, watched the way he moved through the house like a man visiting someone else's home, watched the way he stopped talking at church, stopped going to the diner, stopped meeting his neighbor's eyes. Edward Harris was 52 years old, and he looked 60. He looked like a man who had learned that the rules he thought governed the world were just suggestions, and the real rules were written in fine print on page 6 of documents he had signed but never read. The night Edward came home from signing the sale papers, the night the 120 acres became officially, legally, irreversibly gone. Jonathan waited until his parents went to bed. Then he walked into the kitchen and found the loan contract on the table where his father had left it. He sat down and read it. Every page, every paragraph, every clause, every word of fine print. It took him 2 hours. He was 16 years old, and most of the legal language was beyond him, but he understood enough. He understood that his father had signed a document that gave the bank the right to take his farm at any time for any reason, and that his father hadn't known it because he hadn't read it. Jonathan Wright made a decision that night that shaped the next 40 years of his life. He would never sign a document he hadn't read. He would never agree to a term he didn't understand. And he would never allow 3 words buried on page 6 to do to him what they had done to his father. The law protects the literate, not the just. Jonathan hadn't learned that phrase yet, but he learned the truth of it that night at the kitchen table with his father's contract spread in front of him and a dictionary beside him, and the certain knowledge that the world was less fair than he had believed. That night changed Jonathan Wright forever, but it would take 26 years before anyone understood why. Edward Harris kept farming the remaining 160 acres. He worked the land with the same farmall, 5.6 tractor he had bought in 1958, with cash before the loan, the only piece of equipment that survived the loss because it had never been pledged as collateral. He planted corn and soybeans in the spring and harvested them in the fall, and made every payment on time, even though the land felt smaller. Now, even though driving past the 120 acres that used to be his, and seeing Raymond Peterson's cattle grazing there made something twist in his chest. Edward retired in 1963 at the age of 58. He looked 70. Margaret told people he was tired, which was true, but tired wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that Edward Harris had died inside the day he lost that land, and his body was just taking longer to catch up. Jonathan was 22 when he took over the farm. He inherited 160 acres of good Iowa ground of Farmall 5.6. Oh, that started on the first crank and a promise he had made to himself 6 years earlier in a kitchen lit by a single lamp with a contract spread in front of him. Make it back, all 280 acres, but never the way Dad lost it. Between 1957 and 1963, Jonathan Wright received an education that didn't come from Neola High School. He studied contracts the way other boys studied cars. He kept a legal dictionary in his room purchased from a used bookstore in Council Bluffs for $2. When he picked up seed at the co-op, he read the invoices. When the dealer offered credit terms on equipment, he read the agreements. When farmers talked at the diner about loans and rates and terms, Jonathan listened. The neighbors noticed. They made comments. "That Wright kid reads seed bags like they're novels. Something's wrong with that boy." His father's troubles broke something in his head. Jonathan heard the comments. He didn't respond. He kept reading. In 1962, Jonathan met Pamela Scott at the Council Bluffs Public Library. Pamela was 68 years old, a retired attorney who had practiced property law in Omaha for 40 years before moving back to Iowa to be near her sister. She was at the library researching easement law for a neighbor's property dispute when she overheard a 21-year-old farmer asking the librarian if they had any books on acceleration clauses. The librarian said she would check. Pamela walked over instead. "You're young to be studying contract law." Jonathan looked up. The woman in front of him was small, white-haired, wearing a cardigan despite the June heat. Her eyes were sharp in a way that reminded him of his 8th-grade English teacher, the one who had made him diagram sentences until he could see the bones of language. "My father lost 120 acres because he didn't read his loan contract. I'm making sure that doesn't happen to me." Pamela Scott studied the young man in front of her, tall, thin, serious in a way that suggested experience rather than temperament. She made a decision. "Come to my house Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. I'll teach you what they don't teach in high school." Jonathan showed up at 10 o'clock that Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and every Saturday for the next year. Pamela Scott's living room became Jonathan Wright's law school. She taught him consideration and material breach. She taught him good faith and unconscionability. She broke down legal language into plain English and then built it back up so he could see how the pieces fit together. The law protects the literate Jonathan, not the just. Pamela said this to him on their 3rd session, and Jonathan wrote it down in a notebook he kept for that purpose. Years later, he would still be able to recite that sentence, word for word, still be able to hear Pamela's voice saying it. Banks write contracts to protect banks. Your job is to make them protect you, too. The sessions continued through 1962 and into 1963. Jonathan learned to read the spaces between words, the implications of clauses, the difference between what a contract said and what it meant. When Edward retired in 1963, Jonathan was 22 years old and better prepared to negotiate a loan contract than most attorneys. Pamela Scott had one final piece of advice delivered on their last session in the fall of 1963. "When you go to that bank, Jonathan, remember this. They're selling you money. You're buying it. In any transaction, the person who understands the terms has the power. Make sure that person is you." Jonathan took over 160 acres with the Farmall 560 and a promise. He worked the land alone that first year, living on the savings his father had managed to rebuild and the income from a harvest that was decent but not exceptional. He didn't expand. He didn't buy new equipment. He didn't leverage. What he did was save. Every dollar that didn't go to seed, fertilizer, fuel, or food went into an account at Pottawatomie County Savings Bank. By the spring of 1965, Jonathan Wright had $6,000 in that account and a need for an operating loan to cover the season's expenses. It was time to see if Pamela Scott's lessons had been worth learning. Spring 1965. Jonathan walked into Pottawatomie County Savings Bank wearing clean jeans, a pressed shirt, and boots he had polished the night before. He carried a notebook and a pen. The loan officer's name was Timothy Clark, 35 years old, 10 years into a career that had taught him to spot risk in a borrower's eyes and opportunity in their collateral. Jonathan sat down across from Timothy's desk. "I need an operating loan, $6,000. Timothy pulled a form from his drawer and began filling in the standard fields. Name, address, acreage, collateral. The conversation was routine until Timothy slid the contract across the desk with 3 tabs marking signature lines. Sign here, here, and here. Jonathan picked up the contract. "I'd like to read it first." Timothy smiled the way loan officers smile at farmers who ask unnecessary questions. "Of course. Take your time." Timothy expected 10 minutes. Most farmers spent less. Jonathan spent 45. At the 30-minute mark, Timothy walked past the desk to check on another customer. When he returned, Jonathan was still reading, making notes in his notebook. At 45 minutes, Timothy sat down and tried not to show his impatience. "Any questions, Mr. Wright?" "Several, starting with page 3. What Timothy Clark didn't know was that Jonathan Wright had spent 3 years preparing for this exact conversation. Page 3 contained the interest rate provision, standard language that Timothy had seen in every farm loan for 10 years. Rate of 8% per annum, adjustable at the bank's discretion based on prevailing market conditions. Jonathan tapped the page. "This says adjustable at the bank's discretion. I want it fixed. 8% for the full term of the loan. No adjustments." Timothy's smile faded slightly. "Mr. Wright, our standard loan agreement includes a variable rate provision. All our farm loans, I understand it's standard. I want it changed. Fixed rate, 8%. Or I'll go to First National in Neola." Timothy Clark had closed farm loans for 10 years. He had never had a borrower negotiate terms. He had never had a borrower threaten to walk. He hesitated, then picked up the phone and called Andrew Jackson, the bank president. Andrew Jackson was 45 years old, sharp-featured, with the eyes of a man who calculated risk for a living. He walked out to Timothy's desk and studied the young farmer sitting there with a notebook and a contract covered in pencil marks. "Mr. Wright, I understand you're requesting modifications to our standard loan agreement. I'm requesting a fair contract. Our contracts are fair. Your contracts protect you. I need mine to protect me too." They negotiated for 45 minutes. Jackson probed for weakness and found none. This wasn't a nervous young farmer hoping for favorable terms. This was someone who had studied, prepared, understood exactly what he was asking for and why. Jackson's mind worked through the calculation. Risk versus reward. Wright's 160 acres was good collateral. His payment history, though short, was perfect. His father's payment history before the 1957 disaster had been flawless. The bank wanted the business. Jackson could give ground on the interest rate. Fix it at 8%. Not standard, but acceptable. Fine. Fixed rate, 8%. Jonathan didn't smile. He turned to page 6. And this, the acceleration clause. It says the bank may call the loan in full for any reason the bank deems necessary. I want that limited to actual default on scheduled payments only. Andrew Jackson's eyes narrowed. That acceleration clause is in every contract we issue, Mr. Wright. Then mine will be the first exception. The room went quiet. Timothy Clark watched his bank president and the young farmer stare at each other across the desk. This had stopped being a loan negotiation. This had become something else. Jackson's voice was careful. "Why are you so concerned about that particular clause?" Jonathan met Jackson's eyes. "Because in 1957, my father lost 120 acres to First National Bank of Neola. He'd never missed a payment. Not one. The bank called his loan under an acceleration clause that said for any reason. My father didn't know the clause existed because he never read the contract. He trusted the banker. The banker was his friend." George White. They played baseball together. Their wives were in the same church circle. Jonathan's voice stayed level, but something in it made Timothy Clark stop breathing. "I was 16 years old. I sat in the kitchen and read my father's contract after he went to bed. Every page, every clause, every word. And I decided I would never sign something I didn't understand, and I would never give a bank the right to take my land for any reason other than my own failure." Andrew Jackson sat very still. He was calculating, always calculating, but this calculation was different. This wasn't about money. This was about whether allowing one exception would create a precedent the bank couldn't afford. But it was also about a 16-year-old boy reading a contract in a kitchen and making a promise that had brought him here to this desk, to this negotiation 18 years later. Jackson made his decision. Limited to default on scheduled payments only. Nothing else triggers acceleration. The first modified acceleration clause in Pottawatomie County Savings Bank's history went into Jonathan Wright's loan contract on a Tuesday afternoon in April 1965. The closing took 3.5 hours. Jonathan signed. Timothy Clark witnessed. Andrew Jackson watched the young farmer walk out of the bank and said something Timothy would remember for the rest of his career. "That young man is either very smart or very paranoid." Timothy didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the other contracts he had closed that week, that month, that year, all of them with the standard acceleration clause, all of them signed by farmers who trusted him because trust was what neighbors did. Maybe both. Jackson looked at his loan officer. "Let's hope he's just paranoid. Smart borrowers are expensive." Timothy Clark drove home that evening thinking about Jonathan Wright's father losing 120 acres to George White, a banker who had been his friend. Thinking about every farmer who had sat across from his desk and signed where the tabs were, because they trusted him, because he was their neighbor, because they believed that a handshake and a contract were the same thing written down. What Timothy Clark felt that evening was something he had spent 8 years avoiding: guilt, because every contract he had closed contained the same clause that destroyed Edward Harris. And until Jonathan walked in, Timothy had never questioned it. The word spread quickly. Timothy told the story at the diner that evening, and by the end of the week, everyone in Neola knew that Jonathan Wright had spent 3.5 hours negotiating a loan contract, that he had demanded changes, that he had gotten them. The neighbors talked. Wright spent 3 hours reading a $6,000 loan agreement. Who does that? Something's still wrong with that boy. His father's ghost won't let him rest. Most of them leaned toward one conclusion: Jonathan Wright had issues. Trust issues, paranoia, some kind of break that happened when he watched his father lose that land. Jonathan heard the talk. He didn't respond. He kept reading. In 1967, Jonathan met Catherine Hill at church. She was 24 years old, a school teacher at Neola Elementary, practical and warm in equal measure. On their third date, Jonathan told her something most men wouldn't say until much later. "There's something you should know about me. People think I'm paranoid." Catherine looked at him across the table at the diner. "Are you? I'm careful. There's a difference. Show me the difference." Jonathan took her to the farm the following Saturday and opened the filing cabinet in the small office where his father used to keep records. 3 years of contracts, everyone highlighted and annotated, seat agreements, equipment leases, loan renewals, a paper trail of caution. Catherine read through them slowly. When she finished, she looked at Jonathan. "This is thorough." Jonathan told her the whole story then. The kitchen table in 1957, his father's head in his hands, the contract he read that night, the promise he made. Catherine understood, mostly. There was a part of her that wondered if Jonathan was fighting a ghost, but there was a larger part that recognized something essential. This man would never surprise her with hidden debts or secret obligations. Everything would be written down, read, understood. "I married a man who reads the fine print. I can live with that." They married in September 1968. Catherine moved into the farmhouse where Jonathan had grown up, and she learned to live with the filing cabinet and the notebooks and the way her husband spent 2 hours at the bank every spring renewing an operating loan that most farmers renewed in 20 minutes. The pattern continued. Every year, Jonathan read every contract. Every year, he caught something, a substitution clause in a 1971 seed agreement that would have allowed the company to deliver a different variety without notice, a liability waiver in a 1973 equipment lease that would have prevented him from suing if the equipment failed. Every time Jonathan demanded changes, every time he got them. Brian Thompson, the John Deere dealer in Council Bluffs, said it best at the feed store in 1974. "Wright, you're the most difficult customer in western Iowa." Jonathan's response never varied. "I'm the only customer who knows what he signed." Jacob Allen lived on the adjacent property, 240 acres, that his grandfather had bought in 1921. Jacob was 32 in 1974, the same age as Jonathan, and they had known each other since elementary school. They were different in every way that mattered. Jacob borrowed to expand. Jonathan saved to survive. Jacob trusted handshakes. Jonathan trusted paper. At the diner one afternoon, Jacob said something that got laughs from everyone except Jonathan. "Wright spends 3 hours reading a seed invoice. Who does that?" Brian Thompson had the best line delivered with the timing of someone who had been saving it. Jonathan Wright reads contracts like other men read the Bible, religiously, obsessively, and without understanding why normal people don't. Everyone laughed. Jonathan heard about it later from Catherine. He didn't respond. The neighbors thought Jonathan was paranoid. Jonathan thought the neighbors were trusting. Both were right, but only one would keep their farms. By 1975, the doubts had started to creep into Catherine's voice. Small things at first, questions about why Jonathan couldn't just trust the bank trust, the dealers, trust the people they had known their whole lives. Bigger things later. Arguments about expansion, about opportunity, about whether Jonathan was letting his father's ghost dictate his future. One evening at dinner, Catherine said something that hung in the air between them. "Sometimes I wonder if your father's ghost is making you see danger where there isn't any." Jonathan set down his fork. "The danger is in the contracts, Catherine. Not in my head. I know. I just want you to have friends, real friends, not people who think you're strange. I'd rather be strange and safe than normal and sorry." It was the first crack in Catherine's confidence, but it wouldn't be the last. Pamela Scott died in 1976 at the age of 82. Jonathan was one of 5 people at her funeral. In her will, Pamela had left him a note, handwritten tucked into an envelope, with his name on it. Jonathan, you were the best student I never charged. The law protects the literate. You are literate. Stay that way. P.S. Jonathan framed the note and hung it in his office above the filing cabinet. It stayed there for the next 40 years. The economic shift started slowly in the late 1970s and accelerated into the 1980s. Interest rates began climbing. 12%, 15%, 18%. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker was fighting inflation, and the weapon was the cost of money. Corn prices held steady for a while, then started falling. Land values peaked in 1981 and then began to drop 30%, 40%. The equation that had worked for a generation, borrow against the land farm, the land, repay the loan, suddenly didn't balance anymore. Jonathan's position was different from his neighbors. In one critical way, his loan was fixed, 8%, locked in 1965, and renewed every year on the same terms. He borrowed $6,000 to $8,000 annually to cover operating expenses. Never more, never leveraged. Jacob Allen had borrowed $65,000 in 1978 to buy an additional 80 acres and new equipment. Variable rate started at 12%, climbed to 16.5% by 1982. In the fall of 1978, Jonathan had warned Jacob, "Read the rate clause. It says adjustable." Jacob had laughed. "Everyone's rate is adjustable. You're the only paranoid one with fixed. When rates go up, you'll wish you were paranoid too. Rates aren't going up forever." But they did. Catherine saw what the neighbors were doing and wanted Jonathan to do the same. Expand, grow, take advantage. The arguments intensified through 1980 and 1981. Everyone's growing. We're still at 160 acres. They're growing on debt. We're stable on cash. Don't you want more? I want what's mine to stay mine. You sound like your father. My father lost 120 acres because he trusted. I'm keeping 160 because I don't. The argument ended there, but Catherine's words echoed in the silence afterward. Sometimes I feel like I'm married to a contract, not a man. Jonathan didn't respond. They went to bed without speaking. It happened more often now. The squeeze began in 1981 and tightened through 1982. Land values collapsed. Banks that had been eager to lend became desperate to collect. Farmers who had expanded on credit found themselves underwater, owing more than their collateral was worth. Jacob Allen showed up at Jonathan's door in the fall of 1982. His face was gray. "My loan just jumped to 18%. I can't make the payment. What does your contract say? I don't know. I signed it 5 years ago. Go home. Find it. Read it. Will you read it with me?" They sat at Jonathan's kitchen table, the same table where Jonathan had read his father's contract 25 years earlier, and went through Jacob's loan agreement page by page. Jonathan found what he was looking for on page 6. Variable rate, no cap. Acceleration clause, for any reason the bank deems necessary. Jacob's voice was hollow. "What does that mean?" "It means if they want to call your loan, they can. But I've never missed a payment." "Doesn't matter." Clause says any reason. That's not fair. It's not about fair. It's about what you signed. Jacob left without saying goodbye. Jonathan sat at the table for a long time after looking at the clause that was going to destroy his best friend. In December 1982, while Jonathan Wright was in Timothy Clark's office reading his annual loan renewal for the 18th consecutive year, Andrew Jackson was in a boardroom in Omaha signing an order that would change everything. The examiners from Omaha had made their position clear. The farm portfolio was underwater. 23 loans out of 47 were above 70% loan-to-value. The bank needed to act. Jackson presented his recommendation to the board. We accelerate selectively where we have clear legal grounds. He assigned Mark Anderson to review the contracts and identify vulnerable loans. Mark found 14 with standard acceleration clauses and collateral ratios that justified action. Jackson gave the order. Call them 90 days, full payment or foreclosure. In December 1982, while Jonathan Wright was reading his annual loan renewal in Timothy Clark's office, Andrew Jackson was in a boardroom in Omaha signing the order that would destroy 13 families. One of them was Jonathan's best friend. Tuesday, February 8, 1983. Mark Anderson had 14 names on his list. He started calling at 9 o'clock. By 10:30, he had made 11 calls. 11 farmers, 11 families, 11 lives about to change forever. The 11th call was to Jonathan Wright, and for the first time that morning, Mark Anderson heard something he hadn't heard before. Laughter. Mark Anderson finished the call with Jonathan Wright and sat motionless at his desk. The clock showed 10:03 a.m. 3 calls remained on his list, but his hand wouldn't reach for the phone. Something in Wright's voice had disrupted the rhythm that had carried him through the first 10 conversations. Not anger, not fear, something closer to satisfaction. Timothy Clark appeared in the doorway of the adjacent office. He had heard Mark's side of the exchange through the thin walls that separated loan officers from each other, but not from the truth of what they were doing. What happened? Mark looked up, his face the color of old paper. Wright, Jonathan Wright. He asked me to read the acceleration clause. Timothy's expression shifted. Recognition, then something that might have been dread. And his is different. Timothy crossed the small space between their offices and stood beside Mark's desk. The file lay open between them, but files only contained summaries. The original documents were in storage, archived by year and borrower name. Different how limited to default only. No market conditions, no portfolio reviews, just default on scheduled payments. Timothy's voice came out very quiet. I closed that loan 18 years ago. He negotiated that clause himself. Sat in my office for 3.5 hours and refused to sign until Jackson approved the changes. Mark stared at the file as though it had betrayed him personally. He's asking for a meeting with Jackson. Original documents. Timothy walked to the window that overlooked 4th Street. February snow had turned to slush in the morning sun. 3 decades of farm loans had passed through this building, and until this moment, Timothy had believed they were all essentially the same. Standard terms, standard clauses, standard outcomes when the economy turned against the borrowers. Call him. But I'm telling you now, Wright's right. His contract is different. What Timothy Clark felt in that moment was something close to pride. For 18 years, he had watched Jonathan Wright do something no other farmer did, protect himself. And now, in the middle of the worst crisis Timothy had ever seen, that protection was the only thing standing between Jonathan and ruin. Mark picked up the phone to call Andrew Jackson, and Timothy returned to his office where 11 other files sat stacked on his desk. 11 farmers he had called that morning. 11 families who would lose everything because they had signed contracts they hadn't read. The 12th call went to a farmer named Harrison who raised hogs on 200 acres near Oakland. Harrison listened to Mark's script and then asked a question that made Mark close his eyes. Can they really do this, as take everything? Yes. The contract allows it. I never knew that was in there. Most people don't. Mark made the final 2 calls. By 11 o'clock, 14 conversations were complete. 13 farmers had acknowledged the acceleration and accepted or begun to process what was coming. One had fought back with the precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment. Timothy found Mark in the break room at 11:15, staring at coffee that had gone cold in his cup. You did your job. My job just destroyed 13 families. You didn't write the contracts. You didn't cause the crisis. Mark's voice came out flat. But I delivered the news. I made the calls. And the only farmer who's safe is the one who didn't trust us. Timothy had no answer for that. He had been thinking the same thing since he heard Mark's conversation with Wright. The one farmer who read his contract is the only one who's safe. That's not a coincidence. Jonathan drove into the farmyard at noon. Catherine was in the kitchen preparing lunch, and when she saw the truck arrive early, her first thought was injury, equipment failure, something broken that would need fixing before spring planting. You're home, Erla. Jonathan walked through the door with the expression of a man who had just won a fight he had been preparing for all his life. Bank called the loan. Catherine dropped the plate she was holding. It shattered on the floor in pieces too small to salvage. Her voice came out in a whisper that barely made it across the kitchen. What David Morrison called this morning. Said the bank is exercising the acceleration clause on my operating loan. 90 days to pay in full. Catherine's hands went to her face. Every argument they had ever had about Jonathan's paranoia, about his obsessive contract reading, about whether he was letting his father's ghost control his life, all of it evaporated in the space between one breath and the next. This was 1957 happening again. This was Edward at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. This was everything Jonathan had feared for 26 years coming true. We have to pay the whole loan, Jonathan. We don't have $42,000, Catherine. Stop. The calm in his voice cut through her panic like a rope pulling her back from an edge. Listen to me. They can't call my loan. Catherine's hands came down from her face. Tears were already starting, but his words made no sense against the terror that had seized her. What? My acceleration clause is different. I negotiated it in 1965 with Timothy Clark and Andrew Jackson. They can only call the loan if I default on payments. I haven't defaulted, not once in 18 years. The truth arrived in pieces. First, the memory of Jonathan sitting at that bank for 3.5 hours every spring. Then the filing cabinet full of highlighted contracts. Then all the arguments about trust and paranoia and whether he was broken somehow. All of it leading to this moment when the thing he had feared finally happened, and he was the only one who was ready. You mean all those years, reading every word? This is why. Catherine sat down at the table because standing had become impossible. Relief and shame arrived together, indistinguishable from each other. Relief that they were safe. Shame that she had doubted him, that she had called him paranoid, that she had wanted him to be more like everyone else. I thought you were paranoid. I told you that. I said, I know what you said. Catherine started crying again, but these tears were different. I'm sorry. Jonathan, I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry. Be grateful. Catherine looked at her husband standing in the doorway of their kitchen, and she saw him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not broken, not controlled by his father's ghost, just careful in a world that punished carelessness with loss. What about the others, the other farmers? Jonathan's expression changed. They signed the standard contract. Catherine's next question came out almost too quiet to hear. Jacob Jonathan didn't answer, but Catherine had been married to him long enough to read silence. Oh, God! Jacob! Jacob Allen appeared at Jonathan's door at 8 o'clock on February 9th. Catherine answered because Jonathan was in the barn checking equipment that didn't need checking. She saw Jacob's face and called for her husband. Jonathan came to the door and found his oldest friend looking like something essential had been removed from inside him, and nothing had been put back. They called my loan, $65,000, 90 days. I know. Morrison called me too. Jacob's voice rose slightly. But you said they can't call yours. They can't. Why? Why is yours different? Because I negotiated my clause in 1965. Limited to default only. The words landed between them like stones thrown into still water. Ripples spreading outward into everything they had ever been to each other. You've been preparing for this for 18 years. 26, since I was 16. Jacob's face twisted into something between rage and despair. And you tried to warn me in 1982. You told me to read my contract. You didn't listen. Jacob's voice went sharp because it sounded crazy. Reading contracts like you're a lawyer instead of a farmer, spending 3 hours at the bank, questioning every clause like everyone's trying to cheat you. Jonathan stood in the doorway and let Jacob's anger wash over him because there was nothing else to do. The truth was the truth, regardless of how it felt. You know what everyone says about you, that you're paranoid, that you don't trust anyone, that you're broken somehow because of what happened to your father. I know. They were wrong. You weren't paranoid. You were right. You were right about all of it. The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the space between them. I am going to lose the farm, Jonathan. 320 acres, 3 generations. My grandfather bought the first 160 in 1921. My father added another 80 in 1953. I bought the last 80 in 1978 because I thought land prices would keep going up and interest rates would come back down and everything would be fine because it had always been fine before. Jacob's voice broke on the last word, and I'm going to lose all of it because I didn't read page 6. I'm sorry. Jacob turned to leave, then stopped. Don't be sorry. You tried to tell me. He walked into the February darkness, and Jonathan watched him go. Catherine had been listening from the kitchen. She came to stand beside her husband in the doorway. You could have told him I told you so. What good would that do? He's your best friend, and he's losing everything. I know. Catherine's voice was careful, like someone navigating terrain that might give way. Is there anything you can do? No. His contract is what it is. So you'd just watch him lose his farm. Jonathan's answer came out sharper than he intended. What do you want me to do? Catherine? Sign my farm over to him. Give him $42,000. I don't have. Go back in time and force him to read something he didn't want to read. Catherine didn't respond. The answer was obvious, and they both knew it. There was nothing Jonathan could do except watch his best friend lose everything, while he stayed safe behind a clause he had negotiated when they were both young and the future seemed full of possibilities instead of foreclosures. That's cold. That's reality. They went to bed without speaking. Catherine lay awake until after midnight, listening to Jonathan breathe in the darkness and wondering if wisdom and guilt felt the same when you were the only one who survived. Timothy Clark couldn't sleep. At 2 o'clock on the morning of March 25th, his wife found him in the home office, surrounded by loan files he had brought home from the bank. "Timothy, it's 2 in the morning." He didn't look up from the papers spread across the desk. "I closed 9 of these 13 loans. You've been over this." Timothy's hands moved across the files, touching them like artifacts from a crime he had committed without knowing it was criminal. 9 families. I put the contracts in front of them. I showed them where to sign. Page 3 for initials, page 6 for signature, page 9 for the final acknowledgement. And they signed because they trusted me. His wife came closer, her robe pulled tight against the cold that seeped through the old windows. They trusted the bank. Same thing. I was the bank to them. I was their neighbor who worked at Pottawatomie County Savings. And when I said sign here, they signed. Because neighbors don't lie to each other. Because banks don't destroy the people they serve. Because contracts are just paperwork that makes loans official, not weapons that banks use when the economy turns. "What do you want, Timothy, to go back and make them read?" Timothy looked at his wife, and his voice came out hollow. "I want to have been different. I want to have been like Jonathan Wright was in 1965, 24 years old, asking questions, demanding answers, negotiating terms. I want to have been the loan officer who said, before you sign, let me read you 3 clauses: the interest rate clause, the collateral clause, the acceleration clause. If you don't understand any of them, we don't proceed until you do. You can't change the past." Timothy's hands closed into fists on the desk. "No, but I can change what I do next." His wife watched him gather the files and stack them in a neat pile. She had been married to him for 12 years, and she had never seen him look the way he looked now, like a man who had discovered he had been sleepwalking through his career and had just woken up, standing at the edge of a cliff. Friday, February 11th. Jonathan drove to Council Bluffs wearing the same clothes he had worn to every bank meeting for 18 years. Clean jeans, flannel shirt Catherine had ironed that morning, boots polished the night before. He carried a manila folder under his arm. The folder contained every loan document since 1965. Original contract, 18 annual renewals, every piece of correspondence the bank had ever sent him. All of it organized chronologically, tabbed with colored stickers annotated in Jonathan's handwriting. 26 years of preparation reduced to paper and ink, and the absolute certainty that the words he had signed were the words that would save him. The conference room at Pottawatomie County Savings had witnessed 1,000 negotiations, but this one was different. 4 men in business attire sat on one side of the table. Andrew Jackson, bank president; Mark Anderson, loan officer; Timothy Clark, the man who had closed Jonathan's first loan; Paul Moore, the bank's attorney, brought in specifically for this meeting. Jonathan sat across from them and set the manila folder on the table. He didn't open it yet. He waited. Jackson spoke first, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer registered as tragedy. "Mr. Wright, thank you for coming." Jonathan's response was equally neutral. "Mr. Jackson, I believe we've met before." Jackson's eyebrow lifted slightly. 1965, your first operating loan. You remember. I remember every unusual negotiation. Yours was very unusual." The words hung in the air between them. Timothy shifted in his chair. Mark looked at the file in front of him as though it might contain something he had missed. Paul Moore watched Jonathan with the careful attention of an attorney trying to assess risk. "Mr. Wright, I understand there's some disagreement about the terms of your loan." Jonathan opened the manila folder and removed the 1965 original. The paper had yellowed slightly over 18 years, but the text was still clear. He turned to page 6 and laid it flat on the table. "There's no disagreement. Your loan officer called me Tuesday morning and said the bank was accelerating my loan. I told him to read the contract. He couldn't because he didn't have it in front of him. I did." Jonathan's finger traced the highlighted text. "I've had it in front of me since 1965. The acceleration clause glowed yellow under the fluorescent lights. Jonathan had highlighted it 18 years ago with a marker he still kept in his desk drawer. "This is my acceleration clause." Section 7, paragraph 3. It says, "The bank may accelerate this loan and demand payment in full only in the event of borrower default on scheduled payments." That's the language I negotiated with Mr. Clark in 1965. I have never missed a payment, not one. Jonathan turned to Paul Moore. "Mr. Moore, has there been a default on my loan?" Paul looked at Mark. Mark opened the file and scanned the payment history. "No, Mr. Wright's payments are current." Jonathan's voice remained level, but something in it made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "Then the bank has no right to call my loan. The acceleration clause is limited to actual default. There is no default. The call is invalid." Jackson leaned forward. His mind was already working through the implications, calculating the cost of this exception against the cost of fighting it. "Mr. Wright, our position is that declining collateral values constitute a form of..." Jonathan cut him off. "Declining land values are a market condition, Mr. Jackson, not a maintenance failure. My farm is in better condition today than the day I signed this loan. The fences are maintained. The buildings are sound. The soil is tested and limed every spring. The drainage works. The equipment runs. I haven't damaged the collateral. The market damaged the price. Those are two different things, and my contract doesn't say anything about the market." Jackson turned to Timothy. "Mr. Clark, did you approve this modification to our standard clause?" Timothy's voice came out quiet but steady. "Yes, 1965. Mr. Wright requested the change as a condition of accepting the loan. I brought it to you, and you approved it." "And this clause was carried forward in every renewal," Jonathan answered before Timothy could. "Every renewal carries the same terms as the original, unless both parties agree to changes. I never agreed to change this clause." He reached into the manila folder and removed 18 renewal documents. He fanned them across the table like cards in a game where he held every ace, each one tabbed, each one highlighted, each one showing the same restricted acceleration clause carried forward year after year. The visual impact was immediate. 18 years of paperwork organized and maintained and ready for exactly this moment. Paul Moore picked up the original contract. He read it slowly. Then he picked up the first renewal and read that. Then the fifth. Then the most recent. When he set them down, his expression had changed from cautious to resigned. He looked at Jackson. "The contract is clear, Andrew. Acceleration is limited to default. There's no default. We can't call this loan." The silence that followed felt absolute. Timothy stared at the table. Mark stared at his hands. Paul Moore stared at the contracts. Only Jackson looked at Jonathan, and what passed between them in that moment was complicated. respect mixed with frustration, acknowledgement mixed with anger. This young farmer had outmaneuvered them not with cunning, but with the simple act of reading what he signed. Jackson leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Wright, you negotiated this clause in 1965. You were, what, 24 years old? 22. And you've maintained these records for 18 years. Every document, every letter, every renewal." May I ask why Jonathan had been waiting for this question? He had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, by knowing the truth and being willing to speak it. Because in 1957, my father lost 120 acres of this farm to the First National Bank of Neola. He had never missed a payment, not once. The bank called his loan under an acceleration clause that said for any reason. My father didn't know the clause existed because he never read the contract. He trusted the banker. Jonathan's voice stayed level, but the room had gone very still. The banker was his friend, George Wright. They played baseball together in high school. Their wives were in the same church circle. My father thought a handshake and a contract were the same thing written down. He thought friends didn't use fine print against each other. Jackson's expression shifted slightly. Something in Jonathan's story had found a place in the bank president's understanding. I was 16 years old. I sat in the kitchen and read my father's contract after he went to bed. Every page, every clause, every word. It took me 2 hours. Most of the legal language was beyond me, but I understood enough. I understood that my father had signed a document that gave the bank the right to take his farm at any time, for any reason, and that he hadn't known it because he hadn't read it. Jonathan paused, but not for effect, for breath, and I decided I would never sign something I didn't understand, and I would never give a bank the right to take my land for any reason other than my own failure. The room was quiet enough to hear breathing. Timothy Clark was staring at Jonathan with an expression that might have been pain or pride, or both. Mark Anderson had stopped pretending to review the file. Paul Moore had set down his pen. Jackson looked at the 13 files stacked on the corner of his desk. 13 farmers whose loans were being called that week. 13 families about to lose everything. "Mr. Wright, I can't call your loan. Your contract doesn't allow it. You're free to continue under your existing terms." Jonathan's response was immediate. "I know." Jackson hesitated, then asked a question that revealed more than he intended. "Is there anything else?" Jonathan stood. He gathered his documents and placed them back in the manila folder with the same care he had used to organize them. Every piece of paper accounted for, every clause highlighted, every word that mattered preserved against exactly this moment. Then he stopped at the door. Those other 13 farmers on Mr. Anderson's list, how many of them read their contracts? Jackson didn't answer. The question didn't need an answer. My father didn't read his. It cost him 120 acres and his health and his pride and the last 6 years of his life. He died at 63, looking like he was 80, broken by trust. Jonathan looked at the 13 files. I hope those 13 men have families who can help them through what's coming, because what's coming is what came for my father in 1957. Same clause, same words, same result, 26 years later, and nobody's learned a thing. Jonathan walked out of the bank into February cold that felt clean after the stale air of the conference room. He got in his truck and drove home through countryside he had known all his life, past fields that would be planted in 2 months, past farms that would change hands before harvest, past the 120 acres that used to belong to his father and now belonged to someone else. He pulled into the barnyard and parked. The farm all 560 sat in the same spot it had occupied since 1958. Jonathan walked to it and put his hand on the hood. The metal was cold enough to hurt. He stood there for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just standing on land that was still his because he had read page 6. What nobody in that conference room understood was that Jonathan Wright wasn't celebrating. He was mourning, because he knew that in 90 days, 13 families, including his best friend, would lose everything, and there was nothing his carefully read contract could do to save them. The 90-day countdown began. February turned to March. March turned to April. The 13 farmers tried everything. Some attempted to refinance through other banks, but no bank was lending to farmers in 1983. Some tried to sell assets to raise cash, but the market was flooded with desperate sellers and empty of buyers. Some negotiated extensions that only delayed the inevitable. Jacob Allen tried hardest of all. On March 15th, he appeared at Jonathan's door with a ledger that showed every piece of equipment he owned and its estimated value. "I'm selling everything," tractors, combined planter, grain truck, trying to raise $65,000. Jonathan looked at the numbers. The math was brutal. What's it worth? On a good day, $90,000. Right now, I'll be lucky to get 40. Jacob's 1980 International Harvester combine had cost $85,000 new. In March 1983, with 100 other combines flooding the market from foreclosed farms, it sold for $22,000. His father's 1965 Farmall, the same model as Jonathan's, the one that had survived every crisis because it was paid for and reliable, sold for $2,800 to a dealer who would resell it for twice that when the crisis ended. Jacob stood at the auction and watched 3 generations of equipment disappear for pennies on the dollar. Jonathan stood in the back and watched his best friend lose everything because of words on a page. Catherine saw the guilt eating at her husband. It showed in the way he moved through the house, in the silences that lasted hours, in the way he would stand at the window looking toward the 120 acres that bordered their property. On March 20th, she tried to reach him. "You saved us." Jonathan's response came from somewhere far away. "I saved me. You did the right thing, reading the contracts, negotiating, keeping records, all of it." "Did I? 13 families are losing their farms, and I'm sitting here safe because I read some words on a page. That's not your fault, isn't it? I knew what those contracts said. I knew what could happen. I warned Jacob once Catherine, in 1982 when I saw his loan agreement. I should have what forced him to read it. You can't make people protect themselves." Jonathan turned from the window to look at his wife. "Pamela used to say, 'The law protects the literate.' She was right. But that doesn't make it fair. Fair doesn't matter. Safe matters. We're safe. Jacob's not. Brian Thompson's not. 9 others aren't. And I'm supposed to just be grateful." Catherine's voice was gentle but firm. "Yes, you're supposed to be grateful because your father lost 120 acres and you learned from it. That's not luck, Jonathan. That's wisdom. Wisdom and guilt feel the same when you're the only one who survives." The auctions happened through April and May. 9 of the 13 farmers lost their farms completely. 4 managed to negotiate workouts that saved their operations but cost them significant equity. Every one of them paid penalty fees, accepted higher interest rates, or pledged additional assets. None of them emerged whole. Brian Thompson's John Deere dealership collapsed when half his customer base disappeared into foreclosure. The machines he had sold on credit were repossessed and stacked on his lot like monuments to optimism that hadn't survived contact with reality. Brian filed for bankruptcy in June and took a job selling insurance in Omaha. The character of Neola changed. Empty farmhouses, for sale signs on properties that wouldn't sell for years. Church attendance dropped by a third. The conversations at the diner shifted from weather and crop prices to who had lost what and who was next. Jacob's auction happened on May 3rd. Catherine begged Jonathan not to go. "You don't need to see this. He's my friend. I need to be there." Jonathan stood at the back of the crowd and watched Jacob's 320 acres get divided into parcels and sold for $380 an acre. Land that had been worth $650 2 years earlier. Land that Jacob's grandfather had bought in 1921 and his father had added to in 1953, and Jacob himself had expanded in 1978 because the future was supposed to be better than the past. The total raised was $176,000. After the bank's claim of $65,000 plus fees and penalties, Jacob netted $83,000. 320 acres and 3 generations reduced to a check he would use to start over somewhere else. Jacob saw Jonathan in the crowd. Their eyes met across the distance. Jacob nodded once. Jonathan nodded back. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in the silence between them. After everyone else had left, Jonathan approached Jacob. His friend stood alone in the empty field that used to be his. "Don't, Jacob. I don't say you're sorry. Don't say anything." Jonathan stood silent. "You were right. About everything. The contracts, the clauses, all of it. You were right, and I was wrong, and now I'm standing in a field that used to belong to my family and doesn't anymore. That doesn't make me feel better." Jacob's laugh came out harsh. "It should. You saved yourself. That's more than I can say." The March wind cut across the open ground. In 2 months, this field would be planted by whoever bought it. In 4 months, there would be corn growing where Jacob had stood and lost everything. "I'm moving to Omaha. Got a job at a warehouse. $8 an hour. After farming 320 acres, I'm going to stack boxes for $8 an hour." "Jacob, we're not friends anymore, Jonathan. I can't look at you and not see my farm. I know that's not fair, but it's true." Jacob walked to his truck and drove away. Jonathan stood alone in the empty field and understood something he hadn't fully grasped until that moment. The contract had saved his farm, but it hadn't saved his friend. It hadn't saved his community. It hadn't saved anything except the 160 acres he had inherited and the 120 acres he would soon be able to buy because other people's losses were creating opportunities for those who had prepared. The law protects the literate. Pamela Scott had taught him that, but she hadn't taught him what it would feel like to be literate in a world where everyone else was drowning. On June 10th, Timothy Clark called Jonathan with a proposal that felt like both opportunity and betrayal arriving in the same breath. "Jonathan, I need to discuss something with you, in person." Jonathan drove to Council Bluffs that afternoon. Timothy's office looked the same as it had for 18 years, but the man behind the desk looked different. Older, more worn, like someone who had been carrying weight that wasn't entirely his own. "The foreclosed properties are being liquidated. The bank is selling." Jonathan waited. He had learned patience from watching seeds germinate and contracts evolve. Some things required silence. There's 120 acres. Used to be Allen property, adjacent to your 160. Jonathan's chest tightened, but his face remained still. Why are you telling me this? Timothy pulled a file from his drawer and opened it. Inside were 3 documents: property description, appraisal, offering price. The bank is offering it at $380 per acre, 45,600 total. Jonathan looked at the numbers without touching the paper. Why are you telling me this? Timothy's voice was careful, like someone testing ice that might not hold. Because you have the money. The statement hung between them. Jonathan had never discussed his finances with Timothy beyond the annual loan renewals, had never mentioned savings or accounts or the discipline that turned every dollar not spent on essentials into a dollar saved against catastrophe. How do you know I have the money? Timothy leaned back in his chair. 18 years of annual renewals had taught him to read the story behind the numbers. Jonathan, I've been your loan officer for 18 years. You've never borrowed more than $8,000 in any given year. You've never expanded, never bought new equipment, never leveraged. The Farmall 5.6. Oh, you farm with is the same one your father bought in 1958. Where do you think that money went? Jonathan's hands rested flat on the armrests of his chair. I saved it. How much? $67,000 as of last harvest. Timothy nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he already knew but needed to hear spoken. Then you can afford the 120 acres. The silence that followed felt heavy with implications. Neither man wanted to speak directly. Jonathan stared at the property description. 120 acres, the exact amount his father had lost in 1957. The exact amount that would restore the Wright farm to the 280 acres it had been before George White and the Omaha bankers and the words on page 6 had taken it apart. That's Jacob's land. Timothy's voice was gentle but firm. It was Jacob's land. Now it's bank property, and the bank is selling. Jonathan's mind moved through the calculation. $45,600. He had $67,000 saved. He could buy the land cash and still have $21,400 left, enough to operate for 3 years without borrowing, enough to survive another crisis if one came. But it was Jacob's land, the land Jacob's grandfather had bought, the land Jacob had farmed until 90 days ago, the land Jacob had lost because he trusted handshakes more than contracts. If I buy Jacob's land, he'll never forgive me. Timothy pulled the file back across the desk and closed it. If you don't buy it, someone else will, and you'll have lost the chance to restore what your father lost. Something in Timothy's phrasing made Jonathan look up sharply. What your father's farm was 280 acres before 1957. You have 160. This is 120. The math clicked into place with the force of recognition. Jonathan had spent 26 years preparing to protect what his father had left him. He hadn't considered the possibility of reclaiming what had been taken. My father lost 120 acres because he didn't read a contract. Now I'm being offered 120 acres because I did read mine. Timothy's expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy, or might have been understanding that sympathy wasn't what this moment required. And it's my best friend's land. The land doesn't care who owned it before. It cares who owns it next. Jonathan drove home through June heat that made the horizon shimmer like something uncertain. He found Catherine in the garden pulling weeds that had thrived during the weeks she had spent worrying about foreclosure and relief and guilt. Timothy called. "The bank is selling Jacob's 120 acres, 45,600. Catherine's hands stilled in the dirt. "Can we afford it? I have 67,000 saved." Catherine stood brushing soil from her hands. "The garden could wait. This couldn't." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Do you want the land?" Jonathan's answer came slowly, like something being pulled from deep water. "I want my father's farm back." Catherine crossed the distance between them and took his hands in hers. 18 years of marriage had taught her when to push and when to wait. This was a decision Jonathan had to make himself, but she could show him where she stood. Then buy it. "Jacob will hate me." Catherine's voice was steady. "Jacob already hates you. You said so yourself at his auction. This will make it permanent." "Jonathan, you can't live your life trying to fix other people's mistakes. You read your contract. Jacob didn't. You saved money. Jacob didn't. You protected yourself. Jacob didn't. None of that is your fault. Feelings don't matter right now. Facts matter." Catherine's grip tightened on his hands. "Fact. That land is for sale. Fact, you have the money. Fact, someone is going to buy it. Should it be you or a stranger?" The question settled into Jonathan like the answer to something he hadn't known how to ask. A stranger would buy the land and farm it and never know that 3 generations of Allens had worked that soil. A stranger wouldn't carry the weight of friendship betrayed or the memory of Jacob standing in an empty field watching everything disappear. But Jonathan would. Jonathan would carry all of it, and maybe that was the price of being the one who read page 6. Me. It should be me. He returned to the bank on June 15th with a check for $45,600. Timothy had arranged for Andrew Jackson to handle the closing personally. Some circles needed to close at their beginning. Jackson was waiting in the same conference room where they had met in February. The contrast between that meeting and this one was stark. Then Jonathan had come to defend what was his. Now he was buying what someone else had lost. "Mr. Wright, I hear you're purchasing the Allen property, 120 acres, 45,600. Jackson pulled the deed from a folder and set it on the table. The property description filled half a page. Legal language that reduced Jacob's family history to meets and bounds north by northeast parcel identification numbers. Cash purchase. No loan needed. No loan needed. Jackson's pen moved across the preliminary forms. His voice carried an observation rather than a question. "You've been saving for 18 years. Jonathan's correction was immediate and precise. 26. Since I was 16. Jackson's pen stopped. He looked up at Jonathan, and something in his expression shifted. Understanding arrived like light through a window that had been closed for decades. "Your father's farm. It was 280 acres before 1957, 160 plus 120. "Yes, you're restoring it. I'm buying what's for sale." Jackson's smile was small and knowing. "Same thing." Jonathan signed the deed. His signature looked the same as it had looked on every contract for 18 years. Careful, complete, no flourishes, just his name acknowledging that he had read what he was signing and agreed to its terms. Jackson watched him sign and then spoke words that sounded like they had been waiting years to emerge. "Mr. Wright, I want you to know something. In 1965, when you negotiated your contract, I thought you were paranoid. Today, I think you were the smartest farmer I ever met." Jonathan placed the pen on the table. "I'm not smart. I just read what I signed. That's the same thing." Jonathan walked out of that bank, the owner of 280 acres. The exact acreage Edward Harris had farmed before George White, and the acceleration clause had torn it in half. He had won. He had restored the farm. He had done everything right. So why did it feel like he had lost something far more valuable than land? The isolation began slowly and then accelerated into something that felt like exile. Jonathan farmed 280 acres alone through the summer of 1983. No hired help, no partnerships, no conversations at the co-op that lasted longer than necessary to complete transactions. The neighbors who remained those who had survived the crisis or never been threatened by it treated Jonathan with a careful distance, not hostile, not exactly cold, just separate, like someone who had revealed himself to be a different species than they had believed. The man who bought Jacob's land. Church attendance became an exercise in navigating silences. Jonathan and Catherine would arrive and sit in their usual pew, and people would nod greetings that carried no warmth. The pastor's sermons about grace and forgiveness felt pointed in ways that made Catherine's jaw tighten. After 3 Sundays of this, she stopped going. Jonathan continued alone for another month before he stopped too. The isolation was easier to bear when he didn't have to watch Catherine endure it. The guilt manifested in ways that surprised him. Nightmares where he stood at auctions watching equipment sell while Jacob's face stared at him from across the crowd. Mornings where he would drive past the 120 acres and see not his own land, but the ghost of his best friend's inheritance. For 2 years, Jonathan couldn't bring himself to improve the new acreage. He farmed it, planted it, harvested it, but he didn't build on it, or repair the fences that needed replacing, or paint the small equipment shed that stood on the northwest corner, as though leaving it unchanged might somehow make the purchase less final. Catherine watched her husband carry weight that had no visible form. On May 15, 1985, she found him standing at the kitchen window at 2 a.m. staring toward land he owned but couldn't claim as fully his. "You haven't spoken in 3 days." Jonathan didn't turn from the window. "What do you want me to say?" "Anything. You're drowning in something I can't see, and it's pulling you under. 9 families, Catherine. 9. And I'm still here, because you were careful, because I read some words on a page that they didn't read." Catherine moved to stand beside him at the window. Outside, June stars burned in patterns that had witnessed every farm crisis and every human failure to prepare for catastrophe. Those words mattered. I know they mattered. That's the problem. They stood together in the darkness, and Catherine understood something she had resisted understanding. Jonathan had saved them, but saving had cost him the friendships and community that made survival feel like something other than just nothing. Timothy Clark's transformation began with a single decision and spread outward like ripples from a stone. In the spring of 1984, he added a step to every loan closing. Before the borrower signed, Timothy read 3 clauses aloud: interest rate, collateral, acceleration. If the borrower showed any hesitation or confusion, Timothy stopped the closing until understanding replaced uncertainty. The first farmer to experience this new procedure was a young man named Hayes, who was taking over his father's operation. "That's not necessary, Mr. Clark. I trust you." Timothy's response came from somewhere deep and uncompromising. "It is to me. The closings took twice as long." Timothy's productivity numbers dropped. Other loan officers began closing more loans per week, meeting quotas. Timothy couldn't match. In August 1984, the regional manager called Timothy into his office. "Your closing rate has fallen by half. I know. That's not acceptable." Timothy had been preparing for this conversation since the first time he made a borrower read the acceleration clause. "My default rate has also fallen, by 2/3. The regional manager paused. Timothy pressed the advantage. "The farmers I close with understand what they're signing. They know when rates can adjust. They know when additional collateral can be demanded. They know when the bank can accelerate. And because they know, they plan better. They borrow less. They protect themselves. And when the next crisis comes," Timothy's voice was firm, "they'll survive it because they'll have read page 6. By 1985, Timothy's method had become standard procedure for all loan officers at Pottawatomie County Savings. Andrew Jackson made the announcement at a staff meeting in September. Other banks in Iowa began adopting similar practices. The change rippled outward from one loan officer's guilt into something that might prevent the next crisis from destroying quite so many families. It wouldn't save everyone, but it would save some, and some was better than 13. Brian Thompson appeared at the Neola Co-op in the summer of 1988. Jonathan was picking up seed when he heard a voice he hadn't heard in 3 years. "Jonathan." Jonathan turned. Brian looked different, older, harder in some places, softer in others, the kind of different that came from losing everything and learning to build something smaller but more sustainable from the wreckage. "Brian, I heard about the land. You bought Jacob Allen's 120 acres. I did. Restored your father's farm." "Yes." The silence between them felt like neutral ground where two men who had once known each other were learning to recognize what they had become. "I said some things about you over the years, called you paranoid, made fun of you for reading contracts." Jonathan's voice was careful. "I know." Brian's hands moved to his pockets, then came back out. Nervous energy with nowhere to go. "I lost my dealership because I didn't read page 12 of my franchise agreement with John Deere. There was a clause that let them pull the franchise with 60 days' notice for underperformance. I didn't know what underperformance meant until they defined it for me in 1985. Jonathan waited. This wasn't a conversation that needed rushing. Turned out it meant whatever they wanted it to mean. Sales quotas I didn't know existed. Service standards that weren't in my original agreement, but got added through amendments I signed without reading. Market share requirements that were impossible to meet during a crisis. Same clause, different document. Brian's laugh came out bitter. Same clause, same result. I lost everything because I didn't read the contract. Sold the building, sold the inventory, filed bankruptcy, moved to Omaha. Spent 3 years selling insurance to people who trusted me the way I trusted John Deere. Brian extended his hand across the space between them. "You were right about all of it." Jonathan shook Brian's hand. The grip was firm but brief. "I'm sorry you had to learn that way. I'm sorry I laughed at you." Jonathan's response was quiet but carried weight. "I'm sorry you didn't read yours." Brian left, and Jonathan stood in the co-op parking lot holding a bag of seed and thinking about all the ways people learned lessons. The easy way was reading. The hard way was losing. There was no third option. 7 years passed before Jacob Allen returned to Pottawatomie County. 7 years of silence, during which Jonathan heard nothing about his former best friend, except rumors that filtered through the remaining community. Jacob was in Omaha. Jacob was working a warehouse. Jacob had married someone none of them knew. In the summer of 1990, a truck pulled into Jonathan's barnyard on a Saturday morning. Jonathan was in the barn, maintaining the farmall 560, performing the ritual cleaning, and checking that kept a 32-year-old tractor running like it was 20 years younger. He heard the truck door close and walked out into sunlight that made him squint. The man standing beside the truck was recognizable, but changed. Jacob Allen, at 39, looked like someone who had been broken and put back together with stronger materials. Jacob, Jonathan. 7 years of silence stretched between them like a distance neither man knew how to cross. Jacob walked closer, his movements carrying a certainty that hadn't been there the last time they spoke. "I came to see the farm. My farm. Your farm now." Jonathan wiped his hands on a rag that smelled of oil and metal. "Jacob, let me say this. I've been rehearsing for 7 years. Jonathan went still. Whatever was coming had weight. "When you bought my land in 1983, I hated you. Not because you did anything wrong, because you did everything right, and I did everything wrong, and I couldn't stand looking at the difference." Jacob's voice was steady, like someone who had found solid ground after years of swimming. "I moved to Omaha, worked warehouse for 3 years, stacking boxes, $8 an hour, worst 3 years of my life." His hands moved as he spoke, gestures that helped shape words into meaning. "Not because of the work, because every day I knew I was stacking boxes, because I didn't read a contract. Every box I lifted was a reminder that I had 320 acres, and I lost them because I trusted a handshake more than I trusted words on a page." Jonathan listened without interrupting. This wasn't a conversation. This was a confession that needed witnesses, but not participants. Then something happened. I met a woman, Jennifer Williams. She worked accounting at the warehouse. We started dating. I told her my story one night, the whole thing, the farm, the loan, the clause I didn't read, losing everything. Jacob's expression shifted into something that looked like gratitude mixed with surprise. "You know what she said? Not, 'I am sorry.' Not, 'That's terrible.' Just, 'Did you learn anything?'" The question hung in the air like something still waiting for answer. And I realized, yes, I learned. I learned that contracts matter. I learned that trust isn't enough. I learned that the law protects people who read, not people who hope. Jonathan's throat tightened, but he didn't speak. Jennifer and I married in 1986. Saved money. Every dollar we didn't need for rent or food went into an account. Took us 2 years to save $40,000. In 1988, we bought a farm, 80 acres in Montana, paid cash, no loans. Jacob's answer came firm. "No loans. I don't borrow anymore. If I can't buy it with cash, I don't buy it." Jonathan felt something shift in his chest. Not relief exactly, something closer to recognition. "That's smart." Jacob's smile was small but real. "That's scared, but scared works better than trusting." The wind moved across the barnyard, carrying the smell of earth that would be harvested in 4 months. Jacob looked toward the 120 acres that used to be his, and his expression held no resentment. "Before I bought that Montana farm, I hired a lawyer, paid her $500 to review every document, the deed, the title, the water rights, the access easements, every piece of paper related to that property. $500, she found 3 problems: a lien that wasn't disclosed, an easement that would have let the neighbor drive cattle across my northwest corner, a water rights clause that would have restricted my irrigation." Jacob's voice carried satisfaction that came from lessons learned and applied. We fixed all three before closing. $500 saved me from losing another farm. Jonathan felt pride rise in him like something earned vicariously. You hired a lawyer, I hired a lawyer. And now every contract I sign, I read it, every word. Just like you, I'm proud of you, Jacob. Jacob's expression shifted into something serious. I'm not here for you to be proud. I'm here to say thank you. For what? For trying to warn me in 1982, for being right, even when I called you paranoid, for buying my land instead of letting a stranger take it. Jonathan started to protest, but Jacob raised a hand. I mean it. You restored your father's farm, 280 acres. That's what it was supposed to be, and part of it used to be mine, and now it's yours, and that's right somehow. Jacob's voice carried conviction that surprised them both. I can't explain it, but it feels right, like the land went where it was supposed to go instead of to someone who didn't understand what it cost. Jonathan's voice came out rough. I'm sorry I couldn't save your farm. Jacob's answer was immediate and clear. You couldn't save my farm because I didn't read my contract. That's on me, Jonathan, not you. I should have made you read it. How? How do you make a grown man do something he doesn't want to do? The question had no answer, and they both knew it. Some lessons couldn't be taught. They had to be learned through loss. Are we okay? Jonathan felt tears he hadn't expected. We're okay, good, because I'd like my friend back. I'd like mine back too. They shook hands, and the grip lasted longer than formality required. 7 years of silence collapsed into understanding that some friendships survived death and came back stronger because they had been tested by the worst thing that could happen and found that connection mattered more than pride. It makes you wonder how many friendships, how many relationships, how many lives are destroyed not by malice, but by simple failure to read what we sign, and how many could be saved if we just paid attention. In 2004, Jonathan turned 63, the same age Edward Harris had been when he died. The symmetry felt significant in ways that made Jonathan decide retirement wasn't surrender, but completion of a circle that had begun in 1957. Ryan Walker was 28, Iowa State, educated practical in the way children of careful parents often become. He had farmed alongside his father since graduation, learning not just agriculture, but the discipline that made agriculture sustainable across generations. They stood together in the barn beside the Farmall 560. Ryan's hand rested on the same hood where his father's hand had rested 1,000 times, where Edward's hand had rested before that. I'm handing you 280 acres, same as your grandfather had, same as his father before him. Ryan's voice was steady. I know. You know why we still have it, because you read the contracts. Jonathan pulled open the filing cabinet that held 40 years of documentation. Every loan, every renewal, every seed agreement and equipment, lease and piece of correspondence that mattered. At the front in a plastic sleeve, the 1965 original with the acceleration clause highlighted in yellow. Because I read the contracts. And you need to keep reading them. I will. Jonathan pulled the original from its sleeve and handed it to his son. Not just skim. Read every word, every clause, every provision that could cost you everything if you don't understand it. Dad, I know. You've told me this since I was 8. The corner of Jonathan's mouth lifted slightly. Tell me again when you're 63 and handing this farm to your son. Ryan read the highlighted clause. The words glowed yellow against paper that had aged to cream over 4 decades, only in event of borrower default on scheduled payments. Jonathan's voice carried the weight of history. 3 words in standard contracts destroyed 9 families. For any reason. 3 words I refused to sign saved ours. Remember that. I will. Swear it. Ryan met his father's eyes. I swear. I will read every contract. I will understand every clause. I will protect this farm the way you protected it. Jonathan nodded once. The promise had been made and witnessed. What happened next was up to Ryan and whatever crises the future held. The Farmal 560 stays. Ryan gestured toward the Case IH parked outside. I have better equipment. I know, but the 560 stays. Your grandfather bought it in 1958 with cash before the loan. It survived the 1957 foreclosure because it wasn't pledged as collateral. I've farmed with it for 41 years. Jonathan's hand rested on the tractor's hood. Maintain it. Start it every spring. Drive it around the yard. Because some things, if you take care of them, outlast everything the banks can do. The present arrived slowly and then all at once. Jonathan at 85, Catherine at 83, sitting in the farmhouse office where filing cabinets still held 4 decades of contracts. Ryan farmed the 280 acres with modern equipment, but the old patterns remained. Annual loan renewals that took hours. Contracts read word by word. Clauses negotiated when terms weren't acceptable. Catherine brought coffee and found her husband reviewing documents Ryan would sign next week. Still reading contracts, Ryan's renewing his operating loan. I'm checking the terms. He knows what he's doing. Jonathan's answer was automatic. I know, but I still check. Catherine set the coffee down and sat in the chair across from him. 56 years of marriage had taught her when silence was answer enough. 49 years. You've been reading contracts for 49 years, since I was 16, and we still have the farm. Jonathan's response was simple and absolute. Because I read page 6. Evening found Jonathan in the barn, where the Farmal 560 sat maintained and ready, despite being used only ceremonially now. His hand touched the hood, and the metal was cool under his palm. Through the barn door, 280 acres, spread toward horizons he had defended with nothing more than attention to words most people never bothered reading. People asked me if it was worth it. Reading every contract, negotiating every clause, keeping every document for 49 years, living with a reputation as the paranoid farmer who didn't trust anyone. The voice in his head sounded like his own, but carried echoes of everyone who had shaped him. Edward breaking at the kitchen table, Pamela teaching him that literacy was protection, Timothy learning guilt could become reform, Jacob learning loss could become wisdom. I tell them about my father, how he lost 120 acres to 3 words on page 6, how he died at 63, looking 80, broken by trust. The Farmal 560 looked the same as it had looked in 1958, maintained, preserved, ready. I tell them about Jacob Allen, how he lost 320 acres, 3 generations, because he signed where the tabs were and never read the words. The horizon glowed with sunset that turned Iowa farmland into something that looked almost sacred. I tell them about 9 families who lost everything in 1983 because they believed a handshake was the same as a contract. Jonathan's voice, internal reflective, carrying the weight of a lifetime spent reading what others ignored, continued. And then I tell them about 280 acres that's still in the right name, about a filing cabinet full of documents I actually read, about a clause I negotiated when I was 22 that saved me when I was 42. Was it worth it? The question had been asked 1,000 times by neighbors, reporters, students, studying the farm crisis, anyone who heard the story and wondered if caution was the same as wisdom or just paranoia that happened to pay off. The contract doesn't care if you read it. The contract does what the contract says, and what the contract says is whatever you agreed to when you signed it, whether you understood it or not. Jonathan's hand lifted from the tractor hood. The metal had warmed slightly under his palm. The law doesn't protect the trusting, it protects the literate. The phrase was Pamela's, but the understanding was his. Earned through 49 years of reading words others skipped. Earned through isolation and guilt, and the knowledge that survival sometimes meant watching friends drown while you stood on solid ground built from nothing but attention to detail. My father trusted. I read. The difference was 120 acres and a lifetime of sleeping soundly. The sun dropped below the horizon and the barn filled with shadows that made the Farmall 5-6, look like a monument to choices made and kept. So let me ask you one more time, and I want you to really think about this. Have you read your contracts? Not glanced at them? Not trusted what someone told you they say? Actually, read them, every clause, every provision, every three-word phrase that could cost you everything you own. The question hung in the air like something that needed answering, but would receive only silence from most who heard it. Because somewhere right now there's a farmer or a business owner or a homeowner signing a document they haven't read. And somewhere in that document is a clause they don't know exists. And someday, someone is going to use that clause to take everything they have. Jonathan walked from the barn toward the house where Catherine was waiting. Behind him, the Farmall 5-6, sat in darkness that would give way to morning, and another day on land that remained his because 49 years ago he had made a promise to himself in a kitchen lit by a single lamp. Don't be that person. The words were for everyone who would hear this story and think it couldn't happen to them. For everyone who trusted handshakes more than paper. For everyone who believed that reading was paranoia instead of preparation. Read the contract. The farmhouse windows glowed yellow against gathering night. Catherine would have dinner ready. Ryan would stop by tomorrow with questions about the renewal terms. The farm would continue because someone had bothered to read page 6. Read page 6. The final words settled into silence, like seeds planted in soil that would either grow them into wisdom or let them die from inattention. Either way, the lesson remained. The law protects the literate, and literacy begins with the simple act of reading what you're about to sign. Have you ever caught something in a contract that saved you from disaster, or lost something because you didn't read carefully enough? Share your story in the comments below, because the more people who learn this lesson the easy way, the fewer have to learn it the hard way.